Welcome, dear students. Today our topic of deliberation is Antonio Francesco Gramsci. Antonio Francesco Gramsci was an Italian Marxist philosopher, journalist, linguist, writer, and politician. He wrote on philosophy, political theory, sociology, history, and linguistics. He was a founding member and one-time leader of the Italian Communist Party. A vocal critic of Benito Mussolini and fascism, he was imprisoned in 1926, where he remained until his death in 1937. During his imprisonment, Gramsci wrote more than 30 notebooks and 3,000 pages of history and analysis. His prison notebooks are considered a highly original contribution to 20th century political theory. Gramsci drew insights from varying sources, not only other Marxists but also thinkers such as Niccolò Machiavelli, Vilfredo Pareto, Georges Sorel, and Benedetto Croce. The notebooks cover a wide range of topics, including Italian history and nationalism, the French Revolution, fascism, Taylorism and Fordism, civil society, folklore, religion, and high and popular culture. Gramsci is best known for his theory of cultural hegemony, which describes how the state and ruling capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, use cultural institutions to maintain power in capitalist societies. The bourgeoisie, in Gramscian's view, develops a hegemonic culture using ideology rather than violence, economic force, or coercion. Hegemonic culture propagates its own values and norms so that they become the common sense values of all and thus maintain the status quo. Cultural hegemony is therefore used to maintain consent to the capitalist order rather than the use of force to maintain order. This cultural hegemony is produced and reproduced by the dominant class through the institutions that form the superstructure. Gramsci also attempted to break from the economic determinism of traditional Marxist thought and so is sometimes described as neo-Marxist. He held a humanistic understanding of Marxism, seeing it as a philosophy of praxis and an absolute historicism that transcends traditional materialism and traditional idealism. Now let's see what are the views of Antonio Gramsci on intellectuals. The Prison Notebooks was written by Antonio Gramsci between 1929 and 1936. This collection of notes is one of the major works of Antonio Gramsci that is highly debated in academic affairs. It was written during his stay in the prison and it was not written with an intention of publication. For that reason, his writings are sometimes discontinuous and they were sometimes intentionally vague just to pass the censorship. This paved the way for various interpretations of Antonio Gramsci's writings. Few major issues which were discussed in the prison notebooks are the role of intellectuals, state, and civil society and his idea of hegemony. But it's very difficult to trace the idea of civil society in Gramsci's prison notebook. Sometimes it is clear and evident that he is speaking about civil society or state, but in many cases he does not mention the word civil society exactly, but he adds an element of thought to the broader idea. The role of the intellectuals was the central idea of Gramsci's thought. Karl Marx used this term on a very basic sense by just making a distinction between manual and mental labor. But Gramsci gave a much wider dimension to this idea. Gramsci was very clear in his view that all men are intellectuals, but they are not intellectuals by social function. He clearly stated that all men are intellectuals, but not all men have in society the function of intellectuals. He is of the view that every man outside the sphere of his professional activity carries on some kind of intellectual endeavor. According to Gramsci, there were two kinds of intellectuals, traditional and organic. In the first place, there are traditional professional intellectuals, literary, scientific, and so on, whose position in the interstices of society has a certain interclass aura about it, but derives ultimately from the past and present class relations and conceals an attachment to various historical class formations. Secondly, there are the organic intellectuals, the thinking and organizing element of a particular fundamental social class. These intellectuals are distinguished less by their profession, which may be any job characteristics of their class, than by their function in directing the ideas and aspirations of the class to which they organically belong. To understand Gramsci's idea of intellectuals, we need to observe how he made a demarcation between the different positions of urban and rural type of intellectuals. He compares the urban intellectuals with the subaltern officers in the army. They have developed themselves along with industry and they execute the production plan, which is decided by the industrial general staff who is controlling the elementary stage of work. Antonio Gramsci is of the view that on the whole the average urban intellectuals are standardized, while the top urban intellectuals are more and more identified with the industrial general staff itself. According to Gramsci, the rural intellectuals are much more traditional in nature, mainly because they remain close to the petite bourgeoisie class. This type of intellectuals perform a socio-political role because they create an organic relationship between the peasant class and the organs of the state. Gramsci also gave a kind of class character to the rural intellectuals. The rural intellectuals, like you can say priest, lawyer, teacher, doctor, etc., have a different kind of living standards than the normal peasant community, and they became a source of motivation for the peasant class to improve their standards. While speaking about intellectuals, Antonio Gramsci also mentions about party and its role. David McLean is of the view that the party was the organization of intellectuals that was the most organically linked to its class. It was the collective intellectual, an expression first coined by Togliatti. Party performs the same role as the state in civil society. Hereby, the term party, Gramsci obviously means the role of the revolutionary party. It acts as a binding force to hold together organic intellectuals of the dominant group with the traditional intellectuals, and in this process, they form a tight link among themselves. Gramsci was of the view that the working class should produce its own group of organic intellectuals, which will play a crucial role in revolution. Gramsci's idea of intellectuals was the result of observation of various contemporary state systems. Gramsci was of the view that formation of traditional intellectuals is the most interesting problem historically. In this regard, he mentions about the role of intellectuals in Rome in republican and imperial times. He also mentions how czars created a permanent category of intellectuals just to attract the best intellectuals from the Roman Empire, and they left a trace of cosmopolitanism character in Italian intellectuals up to 18th century. In England, the organic intellectuals came into existence side by side as the economic group, but the landowning class maintained its monopoly. The role of the intellectuals was the central thought of Gramsci's idea. He wanted the subaltern class to realize the socio-economic structure of the society. By doing so, it can create its own class of intellectuals, and that will be a crucial factor in overthrowing the capitalist hegemony. But it must be taken into note that consciously or unconsciously, Gramsci created a class division among intellectuals. All men are intellectuals according to him, but that does not mean that they play same role in the revolutionary process. On the one hand, he is acknowledging different qualities and different capabilities of individual. In this process, he creates a divide between the classes of the intellectual according to their role in the process of social change. Now let's come to Gramsci's view on hegemony. Antonio Gramsci was not the first person to speak about hegemony, but he was the one broadened the idea of hegemony. Earlier, it was understood how hegemony was established to gain the political power, but Gramsci was undoubtedly the first person to say that hegemony is an essential element for a ruling class of people to maintain its authority and power. According to Roger Simon, the starting point of hegemony is that a class and its representatives exercise power over subordinate classes by means of a combination of coercion and persuasion. Perry Anderson is of the view that the term hegemony was first used by Plekhanov and other Russian Marxists in the 1880s. For Lenin, hegemony is working class gaining the access to power with the support of the majority. But for Gramsci, the idea was much broadened. Hegemony was not only about gaining the power, but it also meant maintaining that power. State established this hegemony through other institutions which propagates the ideology of the state. In this regard, Gramsci also speaks about the role of the party, which helps to propagate the counterculture before an attempt was made on state power. Unlike Marx, hegemony was more of a strategy to Gramsci. The intellectuals of the historically and concretely progressive class, he wrote, in the given condition, exercise such a power of attraction that in the last analysis, they end up by subjugating the intellectuals of the other social groups. They thereby create a system of solidarity between all the intellectuals with bond of a psychological nature, vanity, etc., and often of a caste character, technical, juridical, corporate, etc. Gramsci was of the view that the revolution by the proletariat was impossible when the ruling class had its own hegemony. The intellectuals of the working class should actively participate to establish a counter-hegemony. The working class should also come out of its narrow class interest and, if necessary, they need to make compromise to form a unity with other social forces to create larger counter-hegemony. The nobility of Gramsci's idea of civil society is in his understanding of power relations. Typical Marxist understanding of the state denotes that the power lies in the hands of the state. But Gramsci had a very different understanding of this. He observed various institutions in the state which helps the state to propagate its idea and directly helps it to maintain its hegemony. So the understanding of the relationship between state and its institutions are very important to understand Gramsci's idea of hegemony. The idea of a third phase of power or invisible power has its roots partly in Marxist thinking about the pervasive power of ideology, values and beliefs in reproducing class relations and concealing contradictions. Marx recognized that economic exploitation was not the only driver behind capitalism, and that the system was reinforced by a dominance of ruling class ideas and values, leading to Engel's famous concern that false consciousness would keep the working class from recognizing and rejecting their oppression. False consciousness in relation to invisible power is itself a theory of power in the Marxist tradition. It is particularly evident in the thinking of Lenin, who argued that the power of bourgeoisie's ideology was such that, left to its own devices, the proletariat would only be able to achieve trade union consciousness, the desire to improve their material condition, but within the capitalist system. A famous analogy is made to workers accepting crumbs that fall off the table, or indeed are handed out to keep them quiet, rather than claiming their rightful place at the table. The communist Antonio Gramsci, imprisoned for much of his life by Mussolini, took these ideas further in his prison notebooks with his widely influential notions of hegemony and the manufacture of consent. Gramsci saw the capitalist state as being made up of two overlapping spheres: a political society which rules through force and a civil society which rules through consent. There is a different meaning of civil society from the associational view common today, which defines civil society as a sector of voluntary organization and NGOs. Gramsci saw civil society as the public sphere where the trade unions and political parties gained consciousness from the bourgeoisie state, and the sphere in which ideas and beliefs were shaped, where bourgeoisie's hegemony was reproduced in cultural life through the media, universities, and religious institutions to manufacture consent and legitimacy. The political and practical implications of Gramsci's ideas were far-reaching because he wanted of the limited possibilities of direct revolutionary struggle for control of the means of production. This war of attack could only succeed with a prior war of position in the form of struggle over the ideas and beliefs to create a new hegemony. This idea of a counter-hegemony struggle advancing alternatives to dominant ideas of what is normal and legitimate has had broad appeal in social and political movements. It has also contributed to the idea that knowledge is a social construct that serves to legitimate social structure. In practical terms, Gramsci's insight about how power is constituted in the realm of ideas and knowledge expressed through consent rather than force have inspired the use of explicit strategies to contest hegemonic norms of legitimacy. Gramsci's ideas have influenced popular education practices, including the adult literacy and consciousness raising methods of Paulo Freire in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed 1970, liberation theology, methods of participatory action research, that is PAR, and many approaches to popular media, communication, and cultural action. The idea of power as hegemony has also influenced debates about civil society. Critics of the way civil society is narrowly conceived in liberal democratic thought, reduced to an associational domain in contrast to the state and market, have used Gramsci's definition to remind us that civil society can also be a public sphere of political struggle and contestation over ideas and norms. The goal of civil society strengthening in development policy can thus be pursued either in a neoliberal sense of building civic institutions to complement or hold to account states and market, or in the Gramscian sense of building civic capacities to think differently, to challenge assumptions and norms, and to articulate new ideas and visions. Now, let's discuss the Gramsci's view on state and civil society. The idea of hegemony was the central theme of Antonio Gramsci's thought. Antonio Gramsci mentions about state and civil society in parts of the prison notebook. Practically, his idea on state civil society is scattered everywhere in his theoretical work. David McClellan is of the view that although both Gramsci and Marx claimed to be getting their concept of civil society from Hegel, their use of the term was in fact very different. Whereas Marx used the expression of civil society to mean the totality of economic relationships, Gramsci used civil society to refer to the superstructure. In this context, Joseph Fimi is of the view that for the classical Marxist tradition, civil society refers to the infrastructure, the totality of material condition and relationships. But civil society in Gramsci's writings belong to the superstructure, since it comprises ideological or cultural relations. Gramsci got influenced by the work of Cross, and he imagined the state as an ethical state or cultural state, whose role will be to raise the population to a particular cultural level. Gramsci is of the view that the school will play a very important role in this regard, and on the other hand, courts will play a very negative role. State, according to Gramsci, was not only the apparatus of the government but also the private apparatus of hegemony or civil society. It must be taken into note that there is a close relationship between Gramsci's idea of state, civil society and hegemony. Gramsci is of the view that for it should be remarked that the general notion of state includes elements which need to be referred back to the notion of civil society, in the sense that one might say that state is equal to political society plus civil society. In other words, hegemony protected by the armor of coercion. So in Gramsci's idea, civil society and the state are interrelated, but it is very confusing. Sometimes because in some other writings he also makes a clear distinction between the state and civil society. And in his letter of 7 September 1931, he refers to civil society as compromising the so-called private organizations like the church, the trade unions, the schools, etc., and adds it is precisely in civil society that intellectuals operate specially. Krishnan Kumar is of the view that civil society for Gramsci is indeed not to be found in the sphere of production or economic organization, but in the state. But Antonio Gramsci did not generalize the idea of civil society and state. He knew that it clearly varies from the situation to situation and from state to state. He makes a clear distinction between the relationship of state and civil society in East and in West. The context of civil society relationship was totally different in England when it is compared with Russia. And for this reason, only the revolutionary strategy is also different in these two cases. He related the idea of modern warfare with political struggle in this regard to explain the revolutionary strategy. Gramsci got influenced from Rosa Luxemburg's book, The General Strike, to develop his idea on war of movement and war of position. Gramsci integrates the concept of a war of movement and war of position to explain the strategies for the political struggle. In case of war of movement, a system is directly replaced by a revolutionary force. It happened in case of Russia, where there no existence of civil society. It seems to me that Lich understood that a change was necessary from the war of maneuver applied victoriously in the East in 1970 to a war of position, which was the only form possible in the West where, as Krasnov observes, armies could rapidly accumulate endless quantities of ammunition and where the social structure were of themselves still capable of becoming heavily armed fortifications. But this formula is not applicable in the West, where the civil society is strong and vigilant and goes hand in hand with the state. In Gramsci's words, the superstructure of civil society are like the trench system of modern warfare. In war, it would sometimes happen that fierce artillery attacks seem to have destroyed the enemy's entire defensive system, whereas in fact it had only destroyed the outer perimeter, and at the moment their advance and attack, the assailants would find themselves confronted by a line of defense which was still effective. In Western societies, even if the state is destroyed, the revolutionary forces will face a challenge from the civil society, and in that case, war of position is the only option. The result of the war of position are not fast like the war of movement. In case of the former, the change takes place from within, and it takes a longer time. In Gramsci's words, the war of position demands enormous sacrifices by infinite masses of people. In this situation, government will play an important role in organizing all political and administrative forces, and it will reinforce hegemonic position of all dominant groups. Joseph A. Buttigieg is of the view that his purpose is not to repress civil society or restrict its space, but rather develop a revolutionary strategy, a war of position that would be employed in the arena of civil society with the aim of disabling the coercive apparatus of the state, gaining access to political power, and creating the conditions that could give rise to the consensual society wherein no individual or group is reduced to a subaltern status. Gramsci is clearly of the view that the subaltern classes will realize their identity in the sphere of civil society, and they transform into a leading force. But it must be noted that the sphere of civil society is not without strife or competition. There are clash of ideas between various groups within this sphere, and the political reality is established through that dialectical process. Fontana is of the view that civil society is the sphere in which a continual process of conflict and community, dissent and consent is generated. It's here that the dialectic between conflict and consensus, factional strife over particularistic ends, and the generation of common goals is conducted. So, Gramsci's civil society performs a democratic role. Consensus and support is generated with debates and discussion. In Fontana's view, this can be related with the war of position. He says that, in other words, it is here in the sphere defined by civil society that the war of position takes place. As the term implies, the war of position presupposes consensus with the cultural, political, and organizational body of the protagonists, but conflict and strife among and between them. It can be said without any doubt that Antonio Gramsci came out of the Marxist jinx of the class relationships. It must be kept in mind the time in which Antonio Gramsci was writing. The rise of fascism shook his understanding of the world, and he started perceiving things in a different way. Many scholars give too much focus on his writings during his stay in the prison. But to understand the grandeur of his ideas, we must take a look into his early writings also. Then only we can understand his process of ideological transformation. Both Marx and Lenin mentioned about the role of the party in revolution, but he gave total new dimension to this idea. He understood well the fascist strategy of manipulating the working class and how to gain popular support from them. In that situation, the Revolutionary Party should play a role to educate people culturally, which will create a counter-hegemony and finally topple the existing domination. Gramsci's idea gave a hope for the working class that they can also climb up the societal ladder with their intellectual capability. But to make them organized, party will play a very important role. So we can say that Gramsci conceived civil society as the safety valve of the state. If we see the present world order, we will see that how the states are extending its area of influence through civil society organization. This is what Gramsci perceived during his time. But Gramsci prefers civil society more than state because civil society is characterized by ideological hegemony, while state uses force to establish its own authority. So dear students, it was all about today's lecture regarding Antonio Francesco Gramsci. Hope you have enjoyed the lecture. Thank you.